In this video, we're going to talk about myths of strategy. These are commonly held beliefs that I believe get in the way of how we practice strategy. And so I hope to dispel these myths and open up your degrees of freedom to explore and engage in this important practice. So the first myth that we want to cover is that there is a right way. I don't believe there's a right way. Now, with any practice, there are people that are passionate about what they practice, and they will argue at length over a right way or a wrong way. In a lot of cases, such as science and medicine, and perhaps accounting and law, that's probably the right thing to do and find the right way. But in strategic thinking and planning, I don't believe that's true at all. There is no right way. Now, to help understand this is that there's a premise that I follow that all models are wrong and some are useful. Models are inherently simplifications of reality. And in strategy, we're exploring massive complexity of inputs and factors and potential decisions and consequences. It's incredibly complex. And the models and frameworks are helpful to help us deconstruct how we think and how we process all that information to draw some conclusions. But the very fact that they are simplifications mean none of them are right. The only question is, do they help you? And so I think both the person and the situation might call for different frameworks, and so there might be a best way for you to explore making those decisions. So all models are wrong, some are useful, and you ultimately have to find the right approach for yourself. Now, along with that, there's also an aspect that because strategic decision making is really limited to certain individuals, not in the organization, because strategic decisions are made at all levels of the organization, but ultimately there's a decision maker. And so that personality of that decision maker is inherently a factor. If strategy was just all about a process, well, then we could just simply write software for it and it would spit out the answer. But we would miss all the creativity and risk and creation process that comes with strategic thinking. So it is a person-driven and therefore a personality-driven process. So examples of that is how data-driven are you or how intuition-driven are you? That where you fall in that spectrum is going to affect how you go about the strategic thinking process. How inclusive of a leader are you? Do you like to include your team and involve them in a process, or do you like to own key decisions in a more isolated way? This will affect how you make strategic decisions. And even how you perceive risk and are willing to accept it affects how you come up with that strategy. So strategy is a personality-driven thing. There's no way to avoid that when it's done well. It's also situation-dependent. Now, when you think about strategic planning as a process, it often has an annual cycle to it, mostly because it takes so much work that we can't do it more frequently. But at the same time, there's all sorts of inflection points that cause you to go into that mode, whether they be forced inflection points, a new law, a tariff, a restriction that might occur, or it might be opportunistic. The competitive landscape changed, the customer landscape changed, technology became available. And so when those moments occur, when those inflection points occur, you have to go into a strategic mindset, whether it was on your cycle or not. And so how you approach it might very much depend not just when that situation is or how dramatic it might be. And so all of this is many ways to say there is no right way. And we should stop thinking there is. You become stronger by exploring many ways to think about strategy and pull from what works for you in the situations that you find yourself in. The next myth of strategic planning is that we think and then act. That these are separate parts of strategy when, in fact, our actions ultimately determine our strategy, whether it was properly connected to what we thought or not. strategy, when done well, is evolving. It adjusts as you constantly bring in new information. And the very first decision that you make that deviates from the plan, you essentially have changed the strategy. And so strategy is not this process where you divide and conquer. You do the thinking and then you do the acting. It is a constantly evolving practice. And so your strategy might be consistent for a very long time, and then it might feel like you are thinking and then acting, but that's only because you've continued to make decisions consistent with earlier decisions. Fundamentally, you're making strategic decisions numerous times, and the faster your organization moves or your industry moves, the more frequently you're making such decisions. But that's why strategy isn't just a process, it's built into how we think and must evolve as learning, as changes occur, as the environment changes. We have to continue to act in a strategic manner. The third myth that we want to cover is that strategy is always a deliberate act. This just isn't true. Whether you have a strategy or not, you actually do, because the strategy becomes the direction set by all the actions that you have taken. Now, if those actions have a consistent pattern to them, you ultimately have a strategy that is shaped by that pattern. You may not have sat down and mapped it all out, but you've continued to act with a pattern, and that pattern, which might be personality-based, belief-based, has started to shape what your strategy really is. Some of the best strategies do evolve. They evolve through a series of actions that might have been opportunistic, driven by the manager, decision maker, or founder, that ultimately you can look backwards and say, this is what the strategy looks like it was. It didn't happen because someone sat down, mapped it out, and mapped out all the actions, but the strategy evolved through the strategic thinking and actions of that individual. When strategy is a pattern, this can be tremendously powerful, especially when the actions have that consistent and informed nature from that key decision maker. Now, these three myths are just meant to be shared to break free from the sort of shackles of these myths, to explore strategy on your own terms. And ultimately, we have to make this a personal task, because ultimately we own the consequences of the strategic decisions that we make.